All right, everybody, thanks for coming in. Our next speaker today is Cam Hunt from Audubon, New Hampshire.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good, because I talk loud. So thanks, everybody. Some of this we've already had allusions to, both in the keynote and a couple of talks I was in before. So you probably all already know that aerial Insectivores are declining. Did you already know that?
Yes.
You didn't. You don't admit it, but you now do. But before we go there, let's just make sure we're on the same page with what is an aerial Insectivore. And I usually do attractive talks, but I'm going to just sort of tell you. So there's lots of different things. All of these are aerial Insectivores. We're not going to talk about half of those because dragonflies. Yeah, bats. We're not going to talk about kestrels and merlins, which eat tons of insects. We're not going to talk about redstarts and other songbirds that do this. We're going to talk about mainly 4 groups that have been grouped together into this sort of new field of aerial Insectivore ecology. That's nightjars, so whippoorwills, nighthawks, shuffles, widows. The numbers of species are the number of species in the Northeast, New England, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey. 1 species of swift, chimney swift, a bunch of flycatchers, and a bunch of swallows. And all those groups of birds are actually very, very different ecologically, and we'll get to that, and the details of that as we go through this, because that turns out to be one of the stumbling blocks with how we deal with conservation of this group, which actually heads up more than one group. So, populations of aerial Insectivores are in decline. We've been talking about this not very long. This paper is from 2010, so it's only been 14 years or so that this kind of popped on the radar, even though these trends have been going on a very long time. It's just that most of these species are very common. No one thinks about, oh, barn swallows. It's like, they're still everywhere. They're all in people's barns, et cetera. Tree swallows. All these species are very common. But this is from the State of the Birds Canada report a few years back. They actually are the most rapidly declining group of birds in Canada. People worry about forest birds are the green line. People are worried about grassland birds. Not good, but not as bad as aerial Insectivores. And these same broad patterns, like ecological group, apply when you look at U.S. stuff. If you looked at the Rhode Island one, probably looked at the one I wrote for New Hampshire. Aerial Insectivores, along with shorebirds and grassland birds and things like that, are the most rapidly declining ecological groupings of birds. So people have started paying a lot more attention to them. And let's put this in perspective. People have been talking about bobolink conservation, woodthrush conservation, towhees. Carl mentioned towhee this morning. There's all those declines to the Northeast. They're big, they're scary, and there's people working on all of those. And if we just add in our birds, 3 representative aerial Insectivores, throw in a barn swallow in green, in case you don't know the 4-letter codes, bank swallow in pink, and chimney swift in the dark purple line, those declines are just as strong, if not stronger, than the declines we've seen these other iconic conservation priority birds like wood thrushes and bobolinks. Bank swallow alone is just mind-boggling. That sort of exponential loss of bank swallow. So to put these in another perspective, because I like playing with PBS data, and just stick them all on the same scale, there's bank swallow again, and everybody else is kind of the same, towhee, flatlined, and then kind of stayed the same. So the point being that we've lost huge numbers of these birds in these ecological groups. So that's the actual number thing. We can look at other sources of data. I haven't looked at the Rhode Island Atlas, but people are doing bird atlases and comparing things. This is outside of flycatcher in Vermont. The red dots are where it wasn't in the second atlas. The blue dots were new, but there's a lot more red dots than blue dots. So that species lost probably 3/4 of its range in the state of Vermont. We did a similar study in New Hampshire. It's disappeared largely from the southern half of the state. Same thing, the Ontario Atlas for whippoorwill. You can just see this less density of little dots in there. We'll go through home, the cliff swallow, Massachusetts, between atlases. This pattern shows up again and again and again for certain groups. It's not going to show the same pattern for barn swallow. It's not going to show the same pattern for tree swallow. Those are still common. This is just distribution, but the rarer species, their distributions are starting to shrink in various ways. So those are all, a bit more fuel for that fire. You put all of this together, so all the trends, all the ecological stuff about these birds, you can sort of put things in little categories. So there are 20 species we're talking about in the Northeast. 13 of those are declining to some extent. All 3 nightjars are declining. Chimney swift is declining. Only 4 of 10 flycatchers. Flycatcher data is a little funny. We'll get to that. Most of the swallows. If you divide them up into how they forage, so salliers are things like flycatchers and whippoorwills that sit on a perch, go out, catch a bug, and come back. 6 of 12 of those are declining. And that's probably driven by the flycatchers not being as dramatically declining. But 7 of 8 of the hawkers, or the swallows and swifts and nighthawks that fly around the air continuously, picking bugs out of the air without stopping. So they're eating aerial plankton. Most of those are declining. So that might lead us to some questions about what is the prey base and how does that affect what their populations are. One more little way of breaking down the world is how far they migrate. 75% of the species that migrate to South America are declining. Only half of those that migrate shorter distances are declining. So again, put this together, long distance migrant hawkers are declining. And we can all, who can name those? And we'll play a little game. I like being interactive before lunch, keep you on your toes.
Can you repeat the question again?
What people name some of these long distance migratory hawkers that are declining?
Common nighthawk.
Nighthawk's a classic one.
Purple martin.
Purple martin's another one.
Tree swallow.
Tree swallows are not that far. And they're all, yeah, they're declining though.
Nightjar?
We've already got nighthawk. Well, I want one more, then I can hold you till lunch.
Whippoorwill.
Whippoorwill doesn't go that far.
Chimney swift.
Chimney swift, there you go. Chimney swift, barn swallow, cliff swallow are the other 2. Bank swallow is another one. I could name them all, but that's just the idea. So some of these things are showing the strongest declines are actually migrating the farthest, and they're all swallow, nightjar, nighthawk, swift foragers. This is just a graph showing how that works if you compare the PBS data on a standardized scale. You know, so this few species that winter farther north are actually maybe even leveling off. You know, North American winterers is just 2. That's tree swallow and phoebe. And tree swallow declines are relatively small. Phoebe is fairly stable. So if you migrate to South America and need insects up in the air, you're in trouble. So why are these populations declining? This talk is really a summary. There's a couple of research folks at it from stuff I've been doing, but it's really a summary of what we know the current status of some of the research is. A lot of this is being done in Canada. So one hypothesis, this has also been mentioned a few times already, especially in the keynote. You know, we've been losing insect diversity. It wasn't the keynote, it was a later talk, for light pollution talk. You know, the studies coming out of Europe and other places with huge, they call it the insect apocalypse. There are some counters to those studies about how they were done and how they're analyzed, but the point being, you have fewer dead bugs on your windshield every year than you used to. If you think about it that way. Someone could probably do a study looking at sales of windshield washer fluid and correlated with insect populations. Why they're declining is a lot of unknowns. You know, insects could be declining with light pollution, pesticide use, all these sorts of things. And how that influences the birds are little examples here. There's some really fun studies. There was a guy who did a study in Canada a few years back, sampling basically a 12-meter deep thing of swift guano in a chimney in Canada. And as you go deeper into the swift guano, you can look at what they ate over time. And their diets shifted roughly around the time that DDT became prevalent. They switched from eating beetles, which are top predators, to bugs, Hemiptera, which are lower in the food chain. So the higher, just like everything else, DDT was taking up things higher in the food chain, and they shifted their diet from beetles to bugs. Could that be why chimney swift could decline? We haven't really tied that piece together yet, but there's a piece of data there that says major environmental perturbation has had an effect on prey supply of some birds. There's been a lot of talk in the past about whether gypsy moth control, excuse me, I should change that, it's now called spongy moth, related to biocontrol has affected other large silk moths, like the Cercopium moth, the Luna moth, those giant moths that people love are much scarcer than they used to be, and it's possibly because of a parasitic fly that was introduced to take out spongy moths. Light pollution is also probably part of that. Heavily agricultural landscapes, you know, are just increasing as we get towards monocultures and all the other things associated with those. That includes pesticides. There was a guy doing some work in the Midwest a few years back looking at availability of aquatic insects along edges and finding that, if they were closer to agricultural systems, there were fewer mayflies and dragonflies and things like that coming out of those ponds. And it turns out those insects are also very high in omega-3 fatty acids, which are very valuable for birds. So carry through effects of pesticides into water bodies, into the insects that come out of them, circles back. Some of those same pesticide issues may have direct effects on birds. We hear a lot more about neonicotinoids these days. That's the new fancy pesticides that have been used for a few decades. Study out of Europe here showing abundance of birds in more heavily concentrated landscapes, generally lower. This is all birds, so it's not just their insectivores. It's all the sort of grassland, shrubland, what they call farmland birds in Europe. So people have found effects of these on bird migration abilities and other physiological, neurological things. So neonics are an issue. People have been studying mercury. I like down in Virginia. There's a stream that goes through some place that's actually got all sorts of gross mercury in it. And upstream and downstream of that, tree swallows have lower productivity. Because mercury, is not something you want to be ingesting on a regular basis. That's probably a smaller one, but still. So we've got lots of insects, we've got direct effects of some of the insect kind of things, some of the contaminants on these birds. The big boogeyman that's always in the room is climate change. I meant to update that graph, but we got another 20 years almost of data on UV arrival dates. They're still getting earlier. So species that winter nearby are actually advancing like their arrival dates. Species that winter farther away are not. So things that winter in South America are coming back at the same time, roughly, as species as they did 20 years ago. And if that happens and the food supply is an off cycle, because the insects and plants are advancing, colleagues at Hubbard Brook have been doing stuff with this in White Mountains, New Hampshire, that they get there and the food peak may be already too early. There's a lot of work in Europe on this. It's complicated, doesn't always work, but a phenological mismatch between timing of migration or timing of introduction of breeding and food resources can affect populations. So the farther you go, the more likely that's going to kick in. People who study purple martins and other swallows know that the birds get here on their normal time, and there's a weird cold spring rain or cold snap, they can die or abandon their nests entirely. And we're getting more extreme weather, which could increase the more of those weird late spring events that directly affect productivity. Tree swallow, which is one of those close migrants that moves up earlier, egg laying is initiated earlier. So there's an example where it seems to be working fine. So climate, and of course, any of these things can happen in the winter grounds, as we'll get into. A lot of these species are what I call human commensals. They have adapted to use structures that we've built. Where did cliff swallows nest in the Northeast pre-Columbian times? They didn't. So like, where were the meadowlarks pre-Columbian times? They weren't. We built things and they came. We're just Kevin Costner when you need him. It's really old fun, but they're pretty years old, so we're all good. So we created structures. We put chimneys up. Chimney swifts used to nest where? Used to nest.
Tree bark.
Trees, hollow trees. How many big old growth trees are left in the Northeast? Pretty close to zero, and they're all Norway maples and stuff now. So chimney swifts adapted to nest in buildings. Common nighthawks adapted to nest on rooftops. Barn swallows and cliff swallows nested literally on buildings. And so all those habitats are here. So why are these birds declining? People did studies in New Hampshire, a colleague of mine in Audubon, looking at rooftop stuff for nighthawks. We actually made new gravel roofs because they've been shifting the roof. We put that gravel there. Nighthawks don't care. Oh shit. So we built structures, the structures that built out, birds are not. That implies that sometimes the factors affecting us are not here. Really quickly, I'll mention this as an example. Some species like early successful habitats, whippoorwills, leaves, flycatchers. As those habitats mature, those species are disappearing. I'll skip the outside flycatcher stuff. We already talked about how many trees there are, and we'll go to this one. We've mentioned this already too. I'm catching up myself because I repeated myself. Same things we've had in the summer happen in the winter, and we don't know what's going on. We don't even really know where some of these birds are. We know that chimney swifts have this huge range in the Amazon basin of the eastern Andes, but we don't know what they're doing there because they're way up in the trees, and you can't tell it from the native species that go there. So there's a lot of work to be done on what might be happening to these critters in the non-breeding season, including on their way back and forth. Now there's, this is a reference, there's little New Hampshire, way to hell up there. Okay, so I'm gonna do two real quick case studies, very, very quick. They're actually 3 or 4 slides each. I studied whippoorwills for quite a while. There's another talk I haven't seen yet at the symposium about whippoorwills. And the main focus was, we've seen this, they're declining, to sort out what's causing their decline. And this is a very simple diagram that explains that. What I was looking at was habitat use. So this is our study site. The red line is simply the state forest. The yellow boxes are our habitat, greener territories. And what basically you can see, it's hard to see on the slides now, but you can see every now and then they cleared out chunks of the forest. These ones were already here. This is all forest. This is recently cleared before that. And every time this was a private landowner that cleared land here before 2012, whippoorwills were concentrated along the power line and near openings. So we knew this. They like open forest edge habitats. If you make more of it, like the guy did here, like the state did here, they move in. And it's a really tight correlation between where they are in this landscape and whether it's been disturbed or not. And the same thing happens when another student did a bunch of stuff in Ontario. So that gets the whole populations related to habitat change issue. There's also some data, which I didn't do this, looking at the insect population data. Same basic problem situation, that like the chimney swift example, as you lose higher trophic prey, so the predatory insects, so larger, yummier beetles and whatnot, as those decline, then whippoorwills are less likely to be in those locations. And you can even go one step farther to follow up on the talks I was just at in the other room. People doing nanotag tracking and radio tracking of whippoorwills see that they're avoiding heavily lit areas during migration. And is that because there's no food there? Is it because they don't like the light? Stay tuned. Okay, next one, last collection of slides. And I'm just holding you back from lunch, so we're going. This is the fun picture. That's not a bank swallow, it's a rip-wing swallow, but 4 different species of swallows in the same branch is kind of fun. Point peeling, spring, things like that happen. All of these swallows are very different. We've got tree swallows, heavy nesters, loosely colonial, bank swallows, hugely colonial, barn swallows, not really colonial, and cliff swallows, the most colonial species in North America. That colony has more swallows in it than the state of New Hampshire, in Montana. So the issue is they've got really different life histories. They all declining. Know that already? They're all declining. What's interesting, look at these graphs. The declines have often been focused on the north more than the south. The west gets weird, but at least in the eastern half of the continent, the declining part of the north and the south, which brings in that climate change thing again. I can talk about people about later. Oh my God, that's a lot of noise. Some basic stuff, maybe you could read that if you want. I'm sorry, I'm running fast. Running slow. People have been studying a lot of work with swallows in Canada and mostly finding that they are being successfully productive. Which kind of gets at the point that whatever is happening to these populations is not happening during the breeding season. They can produce baby swallows quite well. What happens is those baby swallows don't make it back to Nova Scotia or Rhode, or if it's coming back to. I found the same thing when I'm studying those swallows in New Hampshire. There's some really cool stuff about winter. A lot of winter effects of drought and El Nino events actually are correlated with population changes in bank swallows in Europe. So what happens in the winter, we already know affects these things. So if that makes it worse, drought in sub-Saharan Africa increasing with climate change, that's going to affect those critter populations. I already mentioned number one, the fact that these species weren't here and then are here, you could argue, well, then what about it? They weren't here to begin with. But at the same time, they live in our buildings and yet they're declining, and there's no shortage of places for them to be. So we brought them here, they adjusted to life with us, going back to the keynote. And we kind of want to be, they're canaries in the coal mine. Really, there are problems with those things. We don't know what's going on with them and they're declining. blah, 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 okay. Real quick. This is one no one cares about, but this be something really strongly. There's a whole master's thesis out there for somebody or PhD. Kingbirds, where they migrate? South America. But they're not an aerial one. So there's something else going on there. I think I've said all of this. So the fun part is I started with aerial insectivores, but it comes out that kingbirds are different than cliff swallows, different from whippoorwills, different from these flycatchers. You really can't put them all together. No one's argued that we should put all forest birds together at any point. So, you know, one of the wake-up calls is that we need to look at some of these smaller groupings. Okay, what about the human commensals that nest on buildings and winter in South America? Can we look at them as a group and figure why barn swallows, cliff swallows are doing this? Nighthawks will be different, whippoorwills will be different. So the whole realm of fun stuff here for people to play with. Yeah. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Oh, we'll leave it at the cute little picture. So yeah, there's lots of things we still need to learn, you know. We need people to work in the winter grounds, especially, and we need to get better at this insect thing because that's happening all over the place.